Peace, everyone. Welcome back to another BAB conversation. This is an extra panel that spawned from our last conversation with Diallo. We're going to talk about African-centered leaders, demagoguery that might appear in these circles, and we brought two of our favorite guests. I'll let both of them introduce themselves, and then we'll get started. Y'all know Asafo, you know myself, so I'm pretty sure y'all know these two people as well. So, Lena, you can go ahead and introduce yourself first, and then Diallo.
Hi, I'm Lena Tee. Very popular on, I guess, Facebook, you could say that, in these type of circles. I've been a part of a lot of grassroots African-centered and Pan-African organizations, and kind of just branched out on my own recently, trying to organize something here in the Houston area. So that's a little background on me.
Hi, my name is Diallo. I go by Bro Diallo. I'm a local broadcaster here out of the South Side of Chicago, organizer and Pan-Africanist, revolutionary Pan-Africanist.
All right, we're glad to have you both on. So we're not going to waste any time. We're going to get right down to brass tacks. So at the Bab Talk interview that we did with Bro Diallo, there were some comments made regarding homophobia and homosexuality, and that received a bit of a backlash for some folks in the chat, and then later on social media. What I would like to do now is give Bro Diallo and also Lena, who wasn't a guest, but we're going to give her an opportunity to comment as well. But Bro Diallo, we'll start with you. If you wanted to make any initial comments regarding the backlash from the last BAP Talk.
Okay, I'll try to go over. I saw the comment that the brother made about it, but it's my, I did a whole presentation saying that I was a victim of the gay agenda because I come from where those brothers come from. In the African-centered movement. And when I started to apply, critical analysis, rational evaluation, and basically, follow the historical timeline and trajectories related to the gay rights movement and the gay rights struggle, a lot of the conclusions that I had personally and a lot of the assertions that individuals in the movement that I researched, that I studied, that I even admire, it just didn't hold up. And I began to ask certain leaders within the African-centered movement about, their conclusions and their advocacy, what they advocated for in terms of the LGBTQ plus community and the threat that the LGBTQ plus community posed to Black people individually and the Black empowerment and Black liberation as a whole. And needless to say, it all broke down. So it forced me to make some conclusions and do some self-criticism and reach some harsh realities, accept some harsh realities, not just about that movement, but about people who have been educating us and really hyping the community up or mobilizing individuals in relationship to that community. So in all that to say, whenever I articulate my conclusions, my observations, when I ask these questions and ask for, because my challenge always was, if someone can give me a rational evidence-based argument, I will follow you. You got me. I'm the easiest person to recruit or to seduce for you ladies. All you got to do is give me a rational argument, evidence-based rational argument. And that never came. So anyway, as we were having our discussion, I began to I don't even know how we came to it because that wasn't even the topic of the discussion. But, once we made one or two comments about the gay rights movement and about some of our elders that write or make comments about the movement and its impact on African people in general and the African liberation struggle in particular, like people like Baruti's name came up. And I just said, it's not a rational evidence-based argument. I even went so far as to say that it's more Black men mimicking Protestantism and Black men mimicking white conservatives and far right-wing politics and far right-wing rhetoric. And even with the in Africa, where people say, well, it's anti-African, and I look at I went, line by line, looking at all the anti-sodomy laws, and the moral-based laws, and they're all colonial products. They all came from colonial empires, either Catholic or Protestant colonizers and missionaries set those laws up. I couldn't find any indigenous rules or penalties for it. And so these are questions I ask. And then you go so far as to find a lot of these current anti-LGBTQ movements within the United States, like the Proposition 8 many years back, where you had a lot of Black ministers here and Black politicians and Black ministers and politicians on the African continent. They were financed by groups like Focus on the Family, the Heritage Foundation, and other white, right-wing, neo-colonialist factions of the white oppressors and of the institutions and systems of our oppressors. So all that to say is, all I'm trying to do is come to some rational conclusions and act what's in the best interest of African people. And it very seems that the Black straight pride movement is, a proto-fascist, if not a full-on fascist movement. And whenever you begin to challenge them on their conclusions, they confirm that they're fascist. They demonize and threaten. Has been pretty much, even for members within the group, even people who came up in the group, once they run afoul with the hard line, they become victims. So yeah, I stand on what I said, and I'm not saying it to tear them down. I'm saying it because I want any Black people who are honestly interested in empowerment and liberation to succeed. I want them to be functional and successful. So it's what Dale Jones would call criticism with affection, if you can call it that, and a level of sympathy too, because I was there. I was in that same position. I was Umar and before Umar. So I know it's complex, but I think that's it.
Okay. Sister Lena, is there anything that you would like to add?
I think Diallo did a great job breaking that down, and I do think that the end result of those ideologies is fascism. That's the only result you can come to. But I think it comes from a lot of different places in terms of the origin of it. It's like that last strong foothold we have in our community of getting our people to want to embrace, I guess, their own cultural ideologies and concepts that we have ownership and control over. I think, again, that's tied to the foothold we have with religion and Abrahamic religions, particularly. And when you talk to people and you ask them their core beliefs of let's get to the root of the problem. Like, why do you find this to be, this big issue that's going to end the Black community? It always comes down to their Abrahamic ideology at the end of the day. Like, you could leave the church, but that doesn't mean you've left its values. That doesn't mean you've left its core sentiment. That doesn't mean that you've moved on and embraced things that more serve your interest as a people collectively, or that you even looked into African scholars, or Pan-African scholars, I should say, to really get their side of it and embrace that ideology. You haven't progressed beyond that. So I think we're stuck right now. And a part of that is colonialism, and us finding a way to decolonize and to say, why do we really have an issue with these things? And I think part of it is the gender role. Big part of it is gender roles. They're very afraid that men are going to become feminine. And the root of that, to me, is the concept they can't let go of the fact that they believe that women are inherently inferior. And there's no other way around that, because why else would you be so afraid of a feminine man unless you automatically saw feminine men as being inferior beings? It's kind of like a white man that kind of casts his white not privilege, I don't like that word, but like he casts his whiteness aside to embrace African culture or to embrace African people or defend African people. And then white people get mad and they're like, well, why are you trying to cast your culture aside for something that they see as being inferior? So when you start unraveling it, it's a lot of different things that we really need to get to the root of. It's Abrahamic religion. It's our ideals and concepts about gender and about, you know, an inferior status that is not automatically associated with femininity because it's tied to women. So, I mean, a lot of those things all play into that, but there's no logical basis for it. And the result is going to be anytime you get somebody to agree to an illogical standpoint, they're going to have illogical reactions to them. So I think that's what we're seeing here.
So there was another I won't even call it a critique, but the older guy who shared the video and started giving us names. I want both of y'all to respond to this. It is said that he's an ex-Panther, which I'm not sure about, but he called us socialists and communists. I want y'all to respond. Is that even an insult? And then please speak to this concept of like these African-centered movements lacking class analysis. They call Babas and leaders, but for some reason, they struggle with class analysis.
Yeah, I am a socialist. I'm not a communist, but I support African communists if they think that is because communism is a method or a path towards reaching socialism. So, but I don't really get caught up in the minutia. It's like when people say vegetarian or vegan, you know, if, you know, for a long time, would always try to explain, just like, okay, you know, I see what we're getting at. Semantics do matter a lot, but in that assessment or in that critique, I wouldn't argue or try to explain to him why I'm a socialist, but I don't think that communism is a viable path to establish socialism. But anyway, so I don't see that as an insult. Yeah, I do think I do oppose capitalism. I do oppose private property. I think that profit is theft. I do think that land and all other essential resources should be held in common. I do believe that wealth should be held in common and distributed according to need. And I also think that people who work in an industry or work in a company should should have an ownership of that company, as opposed to people who just hold pieces of paper, stocks or shares or positions in that company having ownership. I believe in worker ownership. So all the elements of socialism on the political and economic scale, I unite with. So yes, I am very much a socialist. I do accept, you know, that that the wealth is created in common and should be held in common and distributed in common. So I don't see that as an insult.
Yeah, I concur with that. I don't see how we could possibly see socialism as an insult. I too identify as a socialist. I'm not against communism. I still think it's better than capitalism. I don't know how any Black person could call themselves a capitalist. One, we have no capitalists because we control no industry. But even beyond that, like, how can you even proudly want to wear a badge of a system that literally fueled your enslavement, your oppression, that's perpetuated continually to this day? So no, I don't know how anybody could identify that with that. I don't even know how you could even put capitalism and African-centered in the same conversation because they're opposites. I mean, there's no place for either one of those things. But I would encourage people who look into socialism to look into not just Marx and Lenin and all that. That's a nice base to get basic concepts of what that is. But they had a lot further to go with that. And I think any system can be corrupted, because a lot of people say, well, socialism isn't perfect and blah, blah. And yeah, any economic system can create, you know, racist bias or whatever. But when you look at, you know, what socialism is and what it gives to people when it's operated correctly, I mean, there's no competitive. I don't think that's an insult. No, I just don't see how he could possibly think that, calling us that. If he knew anything about the African-centered people he supposedly followed, or the scholars, most of them identified in the Panthers. Most of them identified as socialists. So I don't even think he's reading up on the people he says he is.
I don't know if y'all have any like uncles or older people who like swear they was Black Panthers or they was with Larry Hoover or Bumpy Johnson. we don't know back then, but I found that very odd that someone who was a Panther, and again, there are segments in our community that say that Fred Hampton would have evolved or grown into a black capitalist. So I'm not surprised if he really was. But go ahead, Asafo.
Well, so the cultural nationalists, the older black leftists call them pork chop nationalists. So I'll use that term, pork chop nationalists. They've become so much of a cliche that you after being in the movement for 20 years, I almost know what they're going to say before they know what they're going to say. And invariably, when the topic of socialism comes up, their response is, kind of quoting whatever quote that Marx may have said that was against black people. But, and they use that as the pretext or the rationale of throwing out the entire economic ideology of socialism because Marx said something racist.
Right.
But, we have to understand, I refer you to Kwame Ture, and he was quite clear about this when he said that Marx didn't invent socialism or communism. He didn't invent it. He observed it as a social phenomenon, no more than Newton invented gravity. He observed it as a scientific phenomenon or a phenomenon in the natural world. Marx observed communism or socialism as a phenomenon in the economic or social world. So, that's, you just don't. So when you're attributing, communism or socialism to Marx, is just, it speaks to just a lack of knowledge and a lack of knowledge. Like I said, just basic economic principles. So, I'll go ahead, Brother Diallo.
Also, Marx was not anti-capitalist either. Marx was actually thoroughly, if you read his writings, he was thoroughly impressed by capitalism, and he deemed capitalism a necessary step towards communism. He did not think that communism, his conclusion about capitalism is it's only a problem if it overstays, if you continue to employ. He felt that capitalism was necessary in order to build up the industrial infrastructure to have a modern communist society. So once the infrastructure is built up to meet human needs, once the factories and the technology is built up to meet human needs, once you have the capacity to meet all human needs, if you continue to employ capitalism, it will concentrate that in the hands of the few, and the things that used to benefit humanity, like new technological advances, will become a harm to humanity as opposed to a benefit. So, I mean, one of the most prophetic books I've ever read was the Communist Manifesto. It's not even a book, it's a pamphlet. Like, if you took the date and the author's name and the title off the book and read it, you would have swore it was written last week, because everything that he predicted about the overstaying or the to continue to impose capitalism on societies after the industrial buildup has happened. So Marx defined capitalism as an evolutionary process towards to give birth. And we all know what happens if a woman's in labor and she's unable to give birth, the infant and the mother dies. So Marx kind of concluded that if the capitalists do not step aside and step down after they've fulfilled their historical role, then it will lead to essentially ecological and societal collapse. I always say, just to simplify things for people that have a hang up on Marx, Marx's main goal was to humanize Europeans. And he even said as much. He didn't talk very much about outside of pre-industrial and early industrial Europe. He didn't look much beyond that. He didn't go beyond that in his writings and analysis. And all of his examples and historical examples are rooted in Western and Central Europe. So I don't think Marx, Marx was a racist, Marx is this and that. I'm like, was his analysis correct or incorrect? that's what I focus on. And he's pretty thorough and correct. And so was Engel, and to a lesser degree, Lenin and Trotsky. But, we don't need to run to them for examples of socialism. We can go from African antiquity to modern African decolonization movements to look for African-centered examples of socialism, or to Haiti, or to the quilombos of Brazil. We got plenty of indigenous and independent African examples of socialism and communal cooperative economics, where if you're just so pro-Black, and I appreciate you if you are that Black, that you can't digest anything from a white person, I can point you to several African indigenous examples of socialism. We just didn't have the vocabulary that we use now, but all the other infrastructure we had.
So I want to go back to this whole question of the LGBT community, Black LGBT community. So we've seen segments of the African-centered movement now focusing and targeting the LGBT community as proxies for white cultural domination, and they point to them and say that the reason that they're gay is because they're that European culture is homosexual, and we need to check them and deal with them in our community. And so I guess my question to both of you would be, what do you think the end game is to this type of rhetoric, to these type of movements springing up? You and I both agree that the straight Black pride movement is quasi-fascist, proto-fascist. I said in our previous interview, I said neo-fascist, and some idiot misquoted me and said that I said Nazi fascist. I never said Nazi fascist. I said neo-fascist. But anyway, what do you think the end game is for these types of movements?
Me or Dial?
Either one. Yeah.
For me, I think it's the same with a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. It starts with education. You know what I mean? So many people want to come into this movement and be this revolutionary and put on boots and an outfit and walk down the street with guns and all of these different things. And it's like, where's the educational base in all of this? You wouldn't walk into the white man's military and think you're going to become the general because you decided to join. You know what I mean? Or you wouldn't walk into a hospital and try to perform a surgery with no education. It's the same thing. I feel like you can't just jump up and say, because I'm Black, I need no basis to go from. I have no educational, I have no work to do. Like, there's work to be done. And we also probably need to organize better to create more systems or institutions. I don't know if we'll ever have necessarily institutions, but more systems, more programs, more grassroots organizations devoting their time to education. But definitely it's got to start with education, with a Pan-African centered education, because a lot of times when we talk about education, people think that we mean, going to a university and getting a degree, but you're not going to get that education there. You're not going to get anything that's centered in your collective interest as a people there. So I think to get that Pan-African education, there has to be some grassroots movement, grassroots organizations organizing those types of things. But all of it starts, with anything that you wanted to move people beyond a certain thing or accepting a new social norm. It always starts with educating those people about why they need to accept these norms, why they're going to benefit their society, how it's going to progress them further. And so it's the same thing with us. We've got to devote some time to stop and put in the education. And then people who are trying to get involved, who are angry or who are trying to, contribute to the community, they need to take a step back and look for an organization or a program, or start reading, or ask for a reading list from a Pan-African person in your group to start with, and start from there. Because you don't come into the door saying like, I'm gonna be the leader just on your emotional feelings about a situation.
Yeah, I agree with everything the sister says, but in order to really understand the Black straight pride, and I know a lot of Black homophobes or whatever, I know that they're most homophobic Black people are not members of Black straight pride, but you know, they articulate a lot of values and ideas. But first thing we have to realize about Black straight pride and Black homophobia in general, it is mimicry of white people. A lot of things we consider to be militant or Black nationalists is nothing more than draping a kente cloth over white people shit and then claiming it as our own. That's been going on since chattel slavery. So the reason that this is, and what the one of the cornerstones of fascism is, fascism needs scapegoats. Fascism basically misdirects the justified anger and rage of a population that's being exploited, oppressed, enslaved, abused. They misdirect that anger towards scapegoats in order to allow the true source of pain and suffering and exploitation to go untouched. That's why the elites always support fascism. Even though they like to portray themselves as liberal, they feed and support fascism because I don't remember who said this, but they said fascism is the immune system of capitalism. So you're going to find that, number one, these Black straight pride individuals or Black homophobes, they mimic white people word for word. They might say hotep, they might pour libations, they might have the drummers drum them in, but once they're on the mic, you would swear that they were speaking at a CAP conference or at a Heritage Foundation, or they were on a PragerU video. They word for word, they mimic. So they're mimics. So wherever they're going, it's just they're 10 paces behind where white folks are going. If you really want to know where they're going, about, you know, a generation and a half, they're going to be exactly where white people go. And number two is scapegoating. So because scapegoating is very dangerous. So if the movement gets enough power and momentum, then what they will do is ultimately brutalize and attack the scapegoats. The homophobes are not powerful enough to enact collective violence. So you have these isolated pockets of violence, which is unacceptable. But if you go back during chattel slavery, Black people that didn't want to confront the master or the headman, they would say, well, Black folks' problems are because of these lazy niggers, these lazy Blacks that don't meet their cotton quota, that want to sing and chew tobacco and they don't want to work, and they're the problem. And then the ne'er-do-wells in the Reconstruction era, oh, these illiterate ne'er-do-wells, they don't want to elevate, or single mothers. Every single vulnerable Black population at one time was scapegoated for Black problems. Wealthy Black people, oh, these poor Blacks, they want to, you know, I literally not too long ago had a wealthy Black millionaire say the problem with Black people is all these poor Black people buying sneakers instead of investing in stocks. And that's why Black people suffer. And so fascists never address the core of the issue because they are supported and fed by the core, the true sources of the problem. And they always scapegoat and they always mimic. So these are potential outcomes. Either they will drop it once the white evangelical and the white right wing stop scapegoating gays. And if the white right wing, because you do have some examples like Milo Yiannopoulos, there are a lot of white racists, or the Log Cabin Republican, there are a lot of white right-wing LGBTQ who are trying to literally integrate the white fascist, the growing white fascist movement and overt racist. So when white men stop scapegoating and stop being alarmist about the gay rights movement, these people will eventually, within a generation or less, stop being alarmist about it. Or if this movement picks up momentum and the United States descend more aggressively into fascism, then they will be able to organize systematic violence against those they deem the problem. They will, and so that's another potential, which is why they have to be challenged. And they won't stop at the gays. Then they'll go, oh, and these single mothers and these uppity women, these career women who are destroying the fabric of the Black family, these heterosexual, but they're not, these men aren't macho, and they start to cannibalize themselves. That's what fascism does. So that's the trajectory. It'll either fade from existence because white people are no longer there to provide the role models and examples for their movement, or they will become strong enough to where they become a credible material threat to us in a systematic level. They're already a threat, especially to those in their communities and loved ones. We have too many, news headlines about these individuals taking their irrationality out on other vulnerable people. So those are generally the two outcomes of fascist movement. They either burn out or they elevate to more systematic aggression. And even when they elevate to systematic aggression, they get to the point where they start to cannibalize each other, because nobody is pure. In these puritanical movements, nobody's pure. You even see now in the straight pride movement, they start to remember Irritated Genie's right-hand man was Kush the Black Unifier. And where are they now? And all these, I mean, look at ADOS is already being fractioned, and they're already cannibalizing each other. So I hope that's the ultimate thing. They'll burn out and cannibalize each other before they get to the level of systemic and systematic violence.
Well, I'm just real quick, Geechee. I'm just hopeful that the burnout comes before. You know, I was reading we were reading a chapter out of one of these folks' books. The last chapter that the title of the chapter is Endgame. One of these books focusing on the LGBT community, Black community, and it reminded me of, you know, a couple of times, you know, since our last conversation, Diallo, we had mentioned this idea of stochastic terrorism. And the fact that these folks, these babas and elders and other prominent people within this proto-fascist movement will say, if they know that if they say long enough, hey, you know, we got to do something about these gays. These gays are white supremacists. We got to do something about these gays. We got to do something. We got to do something. We got to do something. They know eventually somebody in their group is stupid enough to actually go try to do something.
Right.
And they want to be able to have that plausible deniability and say, now, we never told anyone to be violent.
Right.
We never told anyone to attack anyone.
Well, they're already at that stage.
Yeah.
They're already at that stage, and that's been going on. But they can get to the next stage where they can say, well, yeah, I did tell them, and they're celebrated. I mean, look at the Nation of Islam. There was a popular meme going around where this brother was like, if you think I come here to play with y'all, God damn it, I'm not. And that was the trial of this black man who was incarcerated, and he became a member of the Nation of Islam. And when he came home, he wanted his two baby mothers, one he lived with and one he hadn't, to convert to Islam and be good Muslim women and to cover themselves and to study the Quran, to change their name. And both of the women resisted because they were Christian and did not want to change their religious identity. So that's when he plotted to murder them. And he had the son actually hold a gun to the mother's head and say Allahu Akbar and pull the trigger before he attempted to murder the son. And everyone was talking about this, but for the longest, you have these Muslim leaders from Farrakhan on down talking about how the black family, the black man is the head of the black family, and they're trying to remove the black man as head of the black family, and the black man needs to reassert himself and his power. And during the court case, the man said, the reason I killed my wife is because she was possessed by a white demon and a white devil, and I had to purge the white devil from my family. And the Nation of Islam, once they indoctrinated this brother, totally removed themselves, and they were totally disassociated from the case after that. So we've been dealing with stochastic terrorism for generations.
Right.
And so that's been going on. It just depends on which scapegoat. Some people say, oh, these thugs out here, these gangster rappers are the reason. Black people are their own worst enemies. Any black person that says black people are their own worst enemies is an enemy of black people, because if you define us as the enemy, then you are our enemy. Anybody you define as your enemy, you become their enemy automatically by default. So people blaming our youth, the young people, the gays, these single women, black men who poor blacks and illiterate blacks, black people who like to dance and enjoy themselves as opposed to pursuing profit day and night, don't want to join the grind. So that's been going on. These populations have been getting this. It's just with the LGBTQ, they're more identifiable. They're easier to isolate because of their small number and their prominence in their current prominence in the media. With Pride Month and all that, and the Supreme Court legislation coming down the pike and all that. But this is nothing new. And believe you me, if you could get all these demagogues and reactionaries to abandon their rhetoric about gays. There are so many other vulnerable populations in the Black community that they could pick up tomorrow. Right. Dark skin, light skin, sisters wearing perms. A sister could be submissive. She could be dark skin, unambiguously Black, and hold all the rhetoric. But she got a perm, so she got to go. So they never stop. That's why you can't compromise, you can't negotiate. You have to defeat and purge these reactionaries. Either their mindset, or I say you have to expose, isolate, and expel them, because there's really no way of reasoning with them historically, unless maybe there's some people who have better negotiation and diplomatic abilities than I do. But I haven't seen any example of that.
Yeah, one of the people was on the post and was saying that him and another young brother, it was their time to take over the conscious community. These people, we're taking over. And then, a few weeks later or a week later, one of the beloved elders made a statement that could have been easily taken out of context. He said, actually it is in context. He said, we're not serious because we're not serious. No, we wouldn't even kill our own family members if we had to. Yeah. It's almost like, I'm like, what I mean, that's pretty easy if you're trying to get acknowledged by this elder in hell. But I want to kind of go back to something that you and Lena talked about with Marx and then African education. And there was a point when C.R.L. James was intending to call Garvey a fascist, or he said he had the potential to be a fascist in 1938. And then he kind of backpedaled away from that comment. But he kind of like predicted that. So my question is, there's a lot of people who use Garvey as their blueprint, whether it be race first or whatever they're claiming. I want to know, what have you seen or studied in Garvey's movement that's comparable to some of these people and how they're moving today as leaders or as people carrying on the Garvey traditions? Any contradictions that you've seen to compare the two? I know it's kind of a broad question, but like if any of y'all study Garvey to the point where you can kind of critique him and see how people could possibly make the same mistakes or whatever.
You want to go first, Lena?
Yeah, I can go.
Okay, I'll go after you.
I've never heard that argument made before, so that's interesting. That's a first for me. I could see, Garvey was a Christian, and he did implement a lot of his theological beliefs into the direction, and he did have some things, I guess, that you could on the surface appear that way, but I never seen Garvey attack other Black people in terms of looking for like the weaker populations or calling the poor Blacks the problem of the Black society or any of those. I think if anything, before W.B. Du Bois, got older, that would have been more on his level. I never seen Garvey, take any of this cowardice stances coming after, the weaker groups of the Black community there. Even you could say capitalism, maybe. I don't think he had a stronger grounding in socialism, more so than than other scholars after him. But I don't see the core here as far as what's being done against Black LGBTQ people and trying to separate them from the community. I didn't see him attacking weaker groups and coming for them and making them a problem. I think he was very clear in his definition of what our problems were and who our enemies were, and I don't see any similarities on that end.
Yeah, this kind of breaks my heart because I see the RBG everywhere, and I say, I'll just say the majority of people who fly the RBG have really no grounding or understanding of Garveyism or the UNIA's purpose. Garvey was a Christian, but the UNIA was secular, and secular to the point where, because I don't mind people's personal delusions if your personal delusions do not interfere with your work. And Black folks know how to do that, because I see Christian Black folks go to work for corporations and government agencies that defy their Christian principles every day. So I know we're capable. So if we can do that, for Coca-Cola or for your DMV job, you can do it for Black organizations and movements. But Garvey, to the point where his successor, after he left the UNIA, or was expelled, was incarcerated and expelled by J. Edgar Hoover and the OSS, he put an atheist in charge. And when his atheism came to be known, they petitioned to have him removed as the leader of the U.S. arm of the UNIA. And Garvey said absolutely not, because the UNIA was a secular movement. And but the one mistake Garvey made was Garvey was under the false impression that the reason why African people were oppressed is because we had not demonstrated to Europeans and other men of big affairs that we were capable of constructing and operating the state, engaging in international commerce, building and sustaining a military, building and sustaining a modern national infrastructure. Garvey was under the impression that once African people demonstrated that we were organized and industrial and educated, that Europeans would accept us to the table as equals. So Garvey was a radical for his time. He was an industrialist, but he made a fatal error about the motivations and intentions of our enemies, which he miscalculated. This is not a dig against Garvey. A lot of Garvey's allies even acknowledge this, and this is where Garvey failed. Garvey was also a capitalist. In the time of early industrial United States, there was no such thing as finance capitalism. There was no neo-colonialism. We can critique Garvey after over 100 years of documented history. It's very easy to see what he did wrong. Just like if we spoke to ourselves just 10 years ago, we could break down everything our younger selves did wrong. So just imagine. But Garvey is still to this day one of the greatest organizers, mass organizers, one of the greatest leaders, and gave us one of the best blueprints for Pan-Africanism. And because Garvey is such a great and powerful figure, everybody lays claim to him. The African internationalists want to say he wasn't a Pan-Africanist. The Black capitalists want to claim him. The Black Christians want to claim him. And all these people who are really not consistent with Garvey's ultimate mission, which is the liberation of Africa, Africa for Africans at home and abroad, the liberation and empowerment of Africa, and the utilization of Africa's material and non-material resources for the interest of African people at home and abroad. That's that. If you're not doing that, you can't fly the red, black, and green. If that's not your agenda, you got no business red, black, and green nowhere, calling on the Black Star Line and all those things. And Garvey, again, said, even though these are my personal beliefs, if you read Philosophies and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, he said, I cannot allow my own personal prejudice, my personal beliefs to impact our collective mission. So Garvey put the mission first. Garvey was like a person in a position, the state of where he declared himself president of the African world or whatever, and the titles and stuff. He said the man is interchangeable. Or as one of his students who had a chance to meet him before he passed away, Dr. Clark said, bury the man, continue the plan. So Garvey did make some mistakes that we are continuing to make, by the way. Where we don't have, at least Garvey had 100 years. We've had 100 years to correct, but there are still too many valuable lessons to abandon Garvey. And we also disrespect Garvey in two ways. When we try to manipulate his legacy or what he stood for to fit our petty agendas, and when we fail to we fail to critically evaluate and make the necessary adjustments to his agenda. We don't honor Garvey by mimicking or reproducing what he did. We honor Garvey by building on and expanding. And when you build on something and expand on something, you have to have a very, very ongoing dissection and critique of it, and to restructure it where it's necessary. So, it pains me to see so many people literally trying to pimp Garvey and pimp Garvey's legacy when where you can benefit more for it if you just accept it as is and go from there?
I'll start with this question with you, and then go to Diallo. So on this question of fascism and authoritarianism, over the years, I become nervous when I'm in Black spaces, and this talk of nation building, sovereignty, independence, these type of words come up, and whenever I ask the question, and I personally believe it's a sensible question. What in this new African nation that we're talking about, the sovereign African nation, what are the rights of the individual? And often, I'm, those who don't outright dismiss the question altogether, often respond with the kind of sterile, cliche. There is no individual in African culture, and I often respond to that answer by asking, okay, so what does that even mean in reality? Does that mean because there's no individual in African culture, if I stand on the street corner in the new African nation and I, hold up a sign and I say the Council of Elders or whatever governing body is in this hypothetical African nation, the Council of Elders, I believe they made a wrong decision and I believe they need to be replaced. Could I be arrested for that? Could I be literally snatched off the street and arrested for saying that? Could my personal papers and my belongings be searched for anti-African contraband? Of course, anti-African being defined by the whatever governing body, Council of Elders or what have you. What does it mean to be an individual, as far as you would see it, in an African-centered, an African nation, and a sovereign new African-centered nation? What would be the rights of an individual?
Right. That's a loaded question. I mean, I used to be of the delusion that we could have some type of sovereignty here. We could, have some sort of, separate area and form our own body of government. I no longer believe that's possible. I think it's a progression as you progress through this, where you have those concepts, and there's certain stages that some people stop at and keep moving. But no, I don't think there's ever going to be an African nation within a nation here. I think our only nation that we're going to find is to, go back to Africa and a country there and, integrate into those societies. But what we can build here is we can build systems, we can control our culture. We can control our ethnicity, we can control our cultural values. We can put things in place to basically as resources or lifeboats. I mean, it was never the Panthers or any of the scholars that I've really read into, Amos Wilson. I've never really seen John Henry Clark. I've never seen any of the scholars make an argument that we should try to stay here and have a nation within a nation as it being a long-term solution. It's always been like a lifeboat situation. Like we get our resources here and we sustain ourselves here and we, have some sort of footing until we can make it to the next step. So I think that's the first part of it there, but I don't see any longevity in terms of you can't build a building on quicksand. And at the end of the day, as long as we have no governance and we have no control over the dominant class and what they can and cannot do to us, how can we possibly have the power to control a nation within a nation? How can you have a nation controlled by another nation? That doesn't make any sense to me. So I don't even think that's a possibility. The other part of your question, what you were saying about, I should have wrote some of that down because you said a lot. But should we return back to the past in terms of our cultural values and all of those things? And I think a lot of Black people are of that thought in terms of in the conscious community, in terms of like returning to some antiquated culture. And I seen that in the last discussion as well. And it's like, well, what culture, what nation should we return to? What nation, what sub ethnicity, what Orisha, what should we be embracing? And I don't think that is something that we should be trying to do, because if everything was perfect, we would have never been colonized to begin with, right? So clearly we made some mistakes to get to where we are in terms of combating our oppressors and building a stronger union. So I don't think it's our job to necessarily return to everything. We should embrace the things that work for us, and then we should be cultivating the next step, right? Every generation should be the next step of our liberation, or building the next foundation for the children who come behind us, or the generation who comes behind us. So what can we do to make a footholding for the next people? And I don't think that's about returning to anything. I think it's about formulating and cultivating things that work for us and embracing those things in our own collective interest. And they don't have to look like what we were doing 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 300 years ago. There are core values we should embrace in terms of like collectiveness and our natural socialist culture that we have amongst each other, and our brotherhood and sisterhood we have for each other, and those type of values, of course. But in terms of like trying to standardize a gender role or trying to standardize a religion, no, we're not all meant to be one monolithic society. We're always going to have people who believe in different things, and that's okay, as long as they're not detriment to our collectiveness, and they're not detriment to our ability to withstand our oppressors' tactics being utilized against us. So I think, to me, trying to go back to the past and say whatever we did in the past, we need to keep doing that, that's not how you progress as a society. So we should be looking at how we can move forward. And was that all the questions that you had, or was that, you said a lot. And that's
will he be arrested for challenging the elders in this new system?
For challenging the elders? No, I think any system of governance that we have that's not questionable or that can't be replaced is us building, the same oppression hierarchy that we're trying to escape, right? It's just like the poor Europeans who came here trying to escape an oppression hierarchy in Europe, and then built their own oppression hierarchy here. And are we looking to continue that? Are we looking to further build oppression hierarchies wherever we go? Those are some of the cultural traits that I think we should be looking to shed. So everybody should be held accountable. We should have a system upon which leaders are elected and held accountable for their actions and can be removed or sanctioned. And if they can't, then we're really speaking of a cult. So no, I think that's absolutely ridiculous.
In response, I'm gonna just try to, just go down the notes I took as you were laying out your questions and discussion points. First of all, there's one of the most, white folks have said this is one of the most racist novels ever published in the United States. I'd beg to differ, but it is very racist, called The Turner Diaries. About it's basically a novel about a race war where the white men are the heroes and so on and so forth. But in that book, the neo-Nazi, and I don't like the term neo-Nazis because the Nazis were neo-Americans. They were mimicking the American frontiersmen. The Nazis were emulating American racist and genocide. So you could just say American. You don't have to say neo-Nazi. But these white men in America had this group of population called like-minded blacks or like-minded Negroes, because they even realized no matter how toxically racist black white people become, there will always be a population of blacks who align with them. They acknowledge that. And you look at every single white group, no matter how anti-black it is, if they don't explicitly exclude blacks, they have a black membership. From the Republican Party to the Proud Boys to the Promise Keepers, to, again, I mentioned earlier before, the Heritage Foundation, Focus on the Family, far right-wing evangelicals, Confederacy. The only reason there are no official black members of the Ku Klux Klan is because the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party explicitly exclude blacks. But you cannot find one far right-wing body, organization, ideology that does not have black participants. I would go further because a lot of black people was like, well, I don't like the Confederate flag. Well, I don't like that. I'll never join the Proud Boys. I'll say this. In their efforts to oppress black people and dominate the world, white people have more black allies than enemies. I'll say this again because not enough black people understand this. In their effort to oppress black people and dominate the world, white people have more black allies than black enemies. And to quote another white man, Howard Zinn, you can't be neutral on a speeding train. So unless you are a black person who, number one, use your time, talent, and resources to make a positive contribution to the just aspirations of African people, number one, and number two, have an ongoing desire, effort to subvert global white domination and capitalism, you are an asset and an ally of the oppressor. This isn't something you can passively do. I pick up trash in my community where you know, people say, oh, black love is revolutionary. Black love is not a revolutionary. Getting you a black spouse and loving your black spouse and raising your black kids to do what's right and make sure they get it, that is not revolutionary. That does not subvert the status quo. If it does not challenge and subvert and delegitimize the status quo, it is not revolutionary. So, understanding this, to speak to your thing about black people and our position and in our opposition to white power, we are, I say, you know, to quote Dale Jones again, he said, we lose so much we don't even know what victory looked like. We think Obama's election or Rihanna and Jay-Z reaching billionaire status are victories or examples of black excellence. We go watch the bullshit movies Denzel puts out, his Christian nationalist propaganda, Letter to Jordan, and that bullshit Denzel, and we think that's a victory. You know, we think, you know, black people having their own record labels when they exploit, you know, Puffy, Birdman, exploit black artists more aggressively than the old, you know, the stereotypical Jew record exec did. So we don't even know what victory looks like anymore. We can't even define, at least the ignorant sharecroppers that sent in their pennies to buy shares in the Black Star Lines, at least they knew. They didn't have all this learning, text. They didn't have degrees on their wall, but they understood, hey, these are the good guys. These are the bad guys. Folks that is for us, these are the folks that are against us. That's all been muddied. So it's a lot more complex now. And it's something we have to give more attention to. To the other part of your statement and question, where you talk about black people have to, there's this concept called siege socialism, where the capitalists would say, well, every time a socialist government comes to power, they start to repress the people. And so the socialists started looking internally. It's like, yeah, how come when there's a socialist country, they have militarists, they have these tribunals, they set up these re-education centers, and the people can't just be free. The socialists promise they're going to free us. And then when the socialists come to power, they bring down the hammer. But the problem is because Che Guevara and Fidel Castro had this discussion after they ousted the nationalists. And Che Guevara said, we're going to stay here and build socialism. I mean, Castro said, we're going to stay on Cuba and build a socialist nation. Whereas Che said, you're wasting your goddamn time. Because if you build a social, you'll never be able to live out socialist principles surrounded by capitalists. Capitalists, by their very nature, are expansionist. Capitalism is embedded in colonization, and colonization cannot thrive without capitalist economics. So he said it's a waste of time. He said Cuba should not be a socialist nation. He said Cuba should be a socialist platform for expanding socialism across the globe. The capitalists already said 200 years ago, there will be no other. There is no alternative. Tina, T-I-N-A. There is no alternative. So anything other than capitalism, we will attack and dismantle and destroy, and it will be under constant attack. Whereas socialists say, well, we ran out the capitalists. So now we're going to go about utilizing the resources of our country to feed our people, to house our people, to shelter and clothe our people, to educate our people, and to welcome in anyone that comes. Well, so you have this dynamic where the socialists are on perpetual siege. And then people start to look at socialism under siege and say, wow, socialism is a lie. It doesn't bring freedom when it's under constant attack. And all of us who are in our homes right now, if there are people surrounding our houses and attacking us, and I go tell my son, stay away from the window. And my son says, hey, He's a young college student and he wants to go out to party. You can't go out to party. Y'all stay away from the windows. When I go out of the house, you lock the door and nobody leave till I get back. And when you leave the house, I'm going to escort you out. If you're under siege, the more pressure you feel from the outside, the less freedom you have. So the capitalists, by perpetually attacking and subverting socialist nations, have been able to promote this idea that there's no more freedom under socialism than there is under capitalism. So you might as well go with what you know, because under capitalism, at least I have a chance of becoming Rihanna or Jay-Z. Whereas under socialism, then I'm just going to be under the same repression, but poor. So that speaks to where they talk about, well, you know, the black people, when they come to power, they're just as bad. You know, Idi Amin and what's that other? Mugabe. Oh, they're just as bad as the white colonizers. And we have to understand this concept of siege. We cannot, where Lena talked about, we can't establish an independent republic here. We can't establish an independent nation on the African continent. We have to. This is a globalized system of oppression. We need a globalized system of resistance, and we need global liberation. King said, a threat, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. There is no sanctuary. There is nowhere to run to. I do have a level of frustration with a lot of African people that return to the African continent and say, oh, I found paradise. Y'all need to leave America to come here to escape racism. Y'all need to leave America to come here to escape and to rejoin so we can be. If you're not moving to Africa to join the liberation efforts, if you're not moving to Africa from a better vantage point, to have a better vantage point to fight global capitalism, then you are nothing more than a mimic capitalist. You're taking your U.S. currency and capitalizing off of your first world income, first world opportunities to exploit nations in the third world. And I know a lot of good-natured black people do that, but that's nothing more than colonization. It's no different than a white person doing the same thing. And there are white people every year that retire, move to Mexico, move to Indonesia, move to parts of Africa, because they know that money will stretch further. And they don't go there with any intentions on aiding the revolutionaries in that part of the world or that country to fight off Western imperialism, because most of them have their money locked in Western stock. And if imperialism fell, so would they. So there is no sanctuary, there is no escape, there is no coexistence with global white domination, white hegemony, and capitalism. So wherever we go, we either go to continue to fight, or we go to be basically like-minded assets of our oppressor. And the concept of individual and individualism are two different things. Africa has always respected the individual. The individual was defined as a part of the whole, a segment of the whole. So without each other, we are incomplete. Ubuntu is I am because we are, and we are because I am. The collective creates the individual, and then the individual, through their own unique attributes, feeds back into the collective to strengthen the collective. Individualism is something different. Individualism is the concept that pursuing my own interest is my only obligation and only reason for existing. The individual does not have to suppress their individuality in order to be an asset to the collective. And the collective can only make demands of the individual if the individual is able to derive benefit from the collective. If the collective does not have a place for and does not offer benefit, security, validation, camaraderie, material support, then it is a relationship. It is a mutually beneficial relationship, whereas individualism says the individual can extract all they want and owe nothing back. So this concept is warped, and people confuse being an individual versus being an individualist. I am an individual. I support individuals. I am anti-individualism. I am a collectivist individual. So that's what we have to master. And we also will recognize that the various individuals, people who have different thoughts, different analysis, different ways of visualizing and implementing and constructing physical and immaterial things, philosophies and ideas, music, culture, they are an asset. African people were never threatened by the other. That's one of our assets, and that's one of our greatest follies, but that's a whole different thing to get into. So we need to promote the individual, support the individual, and recognize that we are a unit or a collective of individuals. We do need to reject individualism. Therefore, if you're in an African nation and you're standing there saying, hey, I have positions that are contrary to those in power, then the appropriate response is demonstrate your argument. Give us your evidence. Lay out your opposition. And then when you lay all that out, we can critique and analyze it and say, well, these are the holes in your argument. Can you plug these holes on our behalf? And if you've got a strong argument, strong position about the leadership and a truly just collective society, then we go to the leaders and say, hey, we got some people. And then you say, well, what other people share your ideas? What other people will have your point of view? So you're not rejected and you're not accepted, but you are heard. You are responded to. And if it is a strong enough grounded argument based on our collective agenda and our collective principles and values, then we can advance it. But if you're like, hey, I'm in this society, well, I'm working here and I work hard, or I got a skill that's better than everybody else, so I think I should have a bigger house. I think I should get a Learjet. Why am I sitting waiting in line at the airport, in this African, ideal African society, and I got more education and I contribute more than everybody else, but I got to stand in line. I want a jet, I want a yacht, I want a mansion, I want service, I want profit. And then we'll come to you and say, well, here, if you argue that, and then a small segment of the population is able to have an imbalance of the resources, that can start to erode us and make us vulnerable, woo, woo, woo. So it's all about, so you don't say, well, you said something, we're going to lock you up. You said something, we're going to say, is this valid or invalid? And then we're going to move from there. And finally, there's the fallacy, where it's the appeal to tradition fallacy. If tradition is your only reason for doing something, you should stop doing it. If your tradition is your only, why are you doing that? Because of tradition. You have to be able to say, it's a tradition that has served us over time. It is tradition that has advanced us. It is tradition that has protected us. It is tradition that has enriched us for these reasons. But simply saying, Africans, I get this all the time. Africans are a spiritual people. How you say you're atheists? Our ancestors weren't gay, and the negative confessions of my aunt and gay. And I'm like, well, define, just like before. And the individual say, well, how does it serve us now? You have a right to say it. You have a right. If one of my sons knocked on the door right now, it's like, Dad, you raised us vegan, and why you do that? Or both of my sons were home birth, and they go off and they're about to have children, and they were like, well, Dad, you had a home birth, but now we got socialized medicine, and the hospitals are more responsive, and they have midwives, and it's not as much as a commercial endeavor in the healthcare system. So I feel confident going to a birthing center or going to the hospital to have children. Well, we gave you a home birth. That is our tradition. And I'm like, well, these are our reasons for doing home birth. These were the risk we were willing to take, and these are the benefits that we felt offered having home birth with the midwife at home. But now, 3 decades later, shit is different. And he said, I respect your motivation, so I will hold on to your motivations for doing it. Safe birthing environment for the mother, being able to have a community amongst the people who are bringing our children into the world. So boom, boom, boom. Whatever these values and principles that motivated you from home birth back in the early 2000s, now in the 2040s, this is how we do. So I can't say do it because we did it. I say do it because this is how doing it our way benefited us in the past. So we have to construct cultures and traditions that serve us, not cultures and traditions that bind us, that demand service from us. It goes all the way back to the individual. The individual is only obligated to the group as much as the group serves and feeds and gives services, protections, and these other validation to the individual. And that, if you take that also, you can look at these other Black people, prominent Black people, and say, where do they derive their validation from, their support from? Who are they obligated and dependent on? And a lot of these prominent Black people, from Oprah to all these Black people that I'm always accused of hating on, Obama, we'll see that their community, their support base, their obligation is not the Black community. And they don't serve the interests of the Black community because the community doesn't offer them shit. And I said, in my discussion on leadership, if your leader is not dependent on you for his well-being, he's not your leader. He's their servant. He's their servant. So, I hope I spoke to it. I took a lot of notes here, but
no, it's fine. I appreciate that.
You actually answered a couple questions, so that's great. You answered the African Center question as well. And I know we're not going to be on much longer, so people in the comments, whether you watch on YouTube or Facebook, get your questions in as we get our last questions. And you can go ahead and get into the software. We have another one. I can go again while you
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's a lot of times where, again, the babas and the mamas and the elders and the ancestors, there's sometimes when people be like, well, that's not my baba, that's not my mama, that's not my ancestor. So my question to both of y'all are, again, there's names that's thrown out there, there's books and all these other things, but who are some of the elders and ancestors that you think are worth studying? I know you mentioned Dale Jones a few times. I love studying and listening to his stuff, but both of y'all, who are some elders and ancestors that you recommend that people study? And then again, given this concept of knowing that we would have to critique their work and carry it further, kind of leave some room for what it is disrespecting ancestors and elders versus critiquing their work. So I hope that question is clear.
I would say Francis Fannin. I would definitely say Spillers, Winter, Kwame Ture, John Henry Clark, Amos Wilson, of course, the Panthers. There's so many of them. Who else would I say? I would say there's it to me, I feel like it kind of, you want to start them off. It depends on what level they're on. I would say if somebody was just getting into this, I would recommend a certain set of books for them. But if somebody wanted to have questions about economics or gender, I would recommend different sets of books. Because I mean, there's so many people that you can go on and on about, and class analysis and all that. So I mean, it just kind of depends. But I could post a reading list. I think we should do that at the end. Is post a reading list of some books. Because even naming authors, I wouldn't suggest the same books for everybody. It just kind of depends on where you want to start
at. Yeah, I'd have to say the same. But to be honest, if you don't have critical analysis, you could read the best or the worst books, and they're not really going to have a good impact or a positive impact on you. So I'm glad you say you study these scholars, not worship or follow or try to embody and mimic these scholars, but we do actually study. I'm most critical and most hard on the ideas that I resonate with than the ones I reject, because that's where I'm most vulnerable, where my guard is let down. I feel welcomed and warm, like right on. Everything this brother's saying clicks with me. So that's when I really start to try to dissect and find the holes in that. But like the sister said, everyone she lists, I support absolutely. There is no one that I've found that I agree 100% with, including myself. So go look in the Bro Diallo archives. You're gonna find me. You could probably come up with two sides of every argument. So it is an ongoing evolution process. I think that revolution is an intellectual endeavor, and ideology is all. Without ideology, everything else is pretty much up in the air. If the people don't have the proper ideology, they could be sitting on the greatest material wealth in the planet and live in poverty. If the people don't have the proper ideology, they could be the greatest, most gifted fighters in the world, but still be conquered and routinely overthrown. So ideology, I think, amongst in modern human society it has become prominent. And before you link with anyone, before you join an organization, you have to see if they have a defined ideology. If they don't have a defined and clear ideology that they consistently hold to, then it's a cult led by a demagogue or a cult of personality. So I would say, knowing how to study is even more important than who you study. Because if you do have critical thinking skills, you could read anybody from Dr. Clark, Who Betrayed the African Movement, or Dr. Clark's wonderful book, African World Revolutions, or you could read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, and derive benefit from whatever you meet if you have critical thinking skills and you have a grounded Pan-African liberationist ideology.
With the correct lens, you can make anything you read African-centered.
Right.
Because I remember something you mentioned earlier, Diallo, is something to the effect of, we don't, we're so African-centered, we don't want to read white people's books. And
I'm impressed by people like that. I wish I was that way. I wish I could be like that.
Oh my goodness, and I always tell, and people have confronted me about that. Why are you always talking about white people's books? And I tell people, look, when you have the right critical analysis and ideology, and that guides your how you read things and how you interpret things, anything can be African-centered. You can make anything African-centered.
Yeah.
And
for generations, I'm sorry. Right. No, for generations, I'm sorry. For generations, African people have watched invaders come into African nations and come into African communities and come into African culture and extract benefits. We think that other people, everything from methods and tactics for war, from methods of architecture, everything they take from Africa, they take back to their country and benefit. So I don't really see why Black people should have any hangups about extracting technology, techniques, information, insights. I have so many books written by scumbag U.S. military generals that are very insightful. Men I wouldn't spit on if they were on fire, but I read their books. Coming out of the Pentagon has one of the biggest publishers. The outside of the U.S. Library of Congress, the largest library is the Pentagon Library, because they got militarism is again an academic affair. Revolution is academic. Warfare is academic. Before the weapons come to fruition. They spend, for every year they're engaged in warfare. They, if you believe John Judge, who is another white man that I think every Black person should know, John Judge said for every year they anticipate a war, they spend about 5 years in preparation and research before the U.S. goes into an adventure. And I know we look like, the United States just goes to war. It's a crazy, bloodthirsty nation. But there are more classrooms in the Pentagon than there are shooting ranges. Every single military base has classrooms and libraries. They never build a base with just the gun range and the armory. They also have it for a reason, though. So anti-intellectualism is really fucking us up severely.
I'd also say it's a good insight too. When I was working in corporate America, every year they would make us read 2 or 3 books that the CEO would pick out and put on his best reading list, and half the people wouldn't read them, but I would read them every year. And I read them not because I thought I was going to find anything necessarily life-changing in them, but I wanted a better understanding of their culture and their views and their insights, so I could better read these people and how they move and what they value. So you can get a lot of insight from another group of people just by reading up on some of their views of things and knowing what their arguments are and what their tactics are. I mean, you should never turn away information.
And we're we're all go ahead, brother.
Well, I was going to say Kwame Ture, which Sister Lena mentioned. Kwame Ture said human ideas and human intellect is more powerful than human technology and human weapons, because weapons and technology are the product of our intellect. So if you can outthink of people, it doesn't matter how much wealth or weapons they have. It's always the group that outthinks is that has primacy over the group that's willing to die or shed blood.
I want to get to this. I know we're closing out, but I want to get to this idea of authenticity within the African-centered movement. This idea of too often we have a lot of folks, even people who are influencers and leaders within the African-centered movement, who superficially embrace Africanity or Africanness or whatever you want to call it, superficially embrace it. You have them wearing the clothes, changing their name to some convoluted African name, bragging about the books they've read, bragging about the elders that they know or interviewed or what have you, but really haven't embraced or really haven't internalized a love of African people that should be commonplace with African-centered ideology. It's kind of like baking a cake without the flour. You put everything together and put it in the oven, and whatever, except for the flour, and then whatever mess comes out of the oven, you sprinkle some flour on it after it comes out the oven. And I think that's the situation that we have with a lot of African-centered folks. You go through this anti-Black socialization and education process, and whatever mess comes out the end, you sprinkle some Blackness on it, and that's supposed to be African-centered. So you have people who have the outside accoutrement, if you will, of Blackness, but really hold a lot of Black people in contempt, look down on a lot of Black people, especially Black people they think are beneath them. Here in Horry County, all of our African-centered folks live in Market Common with the rich white folks, and they'll wear their ankhs and their dashikis and locks to the meeting that's going to organize to prevent the low-income housing or affordable housing from coming into Market Common. The chief of police wife, she wants to lecture children about the greatness of Kemet, but every night she lays in bed next to a guy, the chief of police, who is orchestrating a campaign of surveillance and racial profiling in our Black communities. So, you have these people who have this superficial idea of what Africanity or African-centeredness is, but it's just not a genuine part of who they are. What do you all think about that?
I think I'd relate that to the same thing that you see a lot of Christians do. Like they want to trail mix it, they want to take the parts of whatever African culture that they've looked into and hold on to that. And then the rest of it they want to hold on to is, their views for, whatever they admire within colonialism. They'll want to dress like, a West African, but then they're still seeking upward mobility and titles, and rewards from this system. So it's the same thing. And it's all colonialism. It's all just a symptom of colonialism at the end of the day, to not be able to remove yourself from the different distinction of wanting to be able to have the gifts and all of the rewards of being an active, glorifier of this system, but at the same time wanting to turn, I don't know, Africanness into like a costume or something that you can pick up and put down whenever it's convenient for you. It's almost like that's what we're seeing people do. And I don't think that there's any sort of progression. Being able to put African clothing on or being able to know a couple African traditions that literally does nothing in the face of combating oppression. In fact, that was one of the Panthers used to dog a lot of these African-centered people who would come dressed in these full clothes but wouldn't have any sort of ideology whatsoever. So, I mean, at the foot of everything, it's ideology and it's education and having an analysis of our problems and our situations. And you can't contribute to the same ideologies that you claim to be against, by wanting to, I guess, return to whatever idealism you have. But I also think it's us being departed from our culture too, that a lot of people have this fantasy that like Africa was like this utopia where we didn't have any problems and like where everything was perfect. And I think it's also people wanting to believe in this fantasy and return to this fantasy. And there are no utopias. I'm not saying that Africa, was worse, was a horrible place or anything like that. But it was a real society, and it was multiple societies. It wasn't just this one place. And we keep saying Africa like it's a small town. It's a continent, and it's the oldest continent, with most of the oldest cultures on the planet. So even in saying that, it's a lot. But to answer your other question about what people who want to portray one thing, but they're not living that same lifestyle, I would side-eye anyone who basically perpetuates something that they themselves don't stand for. If you're out here talking about being a vegan and you go home and you eat chicken and steak every night, then do you truly believe in veganism? I mean, do you truly believe in the merit of it and the values of it if you proclaim to be that, and that's not something that you yourself live by, but you push it off on other people? So if you're still out here trying to present yourself as some super Afrocentric person, but you don't have any ideology, you don't have any history, you can't name any of the scholars, you don't know any of the events or the tactics, you don't have any analysis, you don't have any class analysis, gender analysis, I don't think that you can portray yourself in that light. You're just putting on one tiny piece of a costume. You're actually doing more harm than good. I would much rather we had African people walking around that had ideology, that had principles, that had historical analysis, than having people walk around in, African wear and changing their names. I mean, it's superficial.
We have to realize as African people, the Uncle Tom, the Sambo, the race trader has mutated over generations. There was one time the characteristics that define what a race trader is change. And there was a time where the race trader was a docile, passive black, or there could be the industrious black who's willing to pull himself up by the bootstrap and cast down his pail where he stands. But in the 60s, in the post-civil rights era, the Uncle Tom, the race trader, became militant. And even later, they became Afrocentric because it was a time where they would be openly articulate their hostility for the black masses. There's a book called Black Judas, written by a black man written about a black man who was a World War II veteran. He was a Unionist soldier, and he was a hero fighting against the Confederates. And he came to say that black people are the worst thing in the world, and that he's the real Uncle Ruckus, like a real life Uncle Ruckus. Or Bill Cosby. I think Bill Cosby was the prototype for Uncle Ruckus and Black Judas. But anyway, I don't want to get off track, but we forget that they evolve in our time. We forget that how they I don't even say evolve, they mutate. So Khalid Muhammad, in his last public address in Harlem, talked about what he called the new Negro. And he said there was a time where the new Negro, or the Uncle Tom, the Sambo, the race trader, would have open hostility to black people and black people's interests. Whereas now, those people who say they have the exact same agenda to serve the interests of whites and to direct or demobilize black rage or black power to serve the interests of the white oppressors. So he said now they're the most Afrocentric. They show up at the cultural events. They wear the dashikis. They claim to be community organizers. They marry black spouses. And so they have mutated to the point where we can't tell the difference of the African people acting in our interests versus the African people actively subverting our interests. So I had developed what is called trademark, the new Negro self-exposure protocol, patent pending. I'm lying. It's not trademark. Everything I do is Creative Commons. But it basically says that all African people with a public platform or that have a public voice will eventually expose themselves. They will eventually demonstrate where they stand, because it is impossible for anyone in this day and age to live out a lie. So no matter what a black person claims they stand for, they will eventually self-expose. And if we go off the self-exposure protocol, that reduces a lot of infighting, nitpicking, and backbiting that goes on with he said, she said. So whenever you want to tear down a black person, you can't say, well, so-and-so said this about so-and-so. This brother told me this about that brother, or this sister told me that about this sister. You say this person themselves said this thing. This person themselves took this position. This person themselves is moving in this way. And then what you have to do with that is you don't do like Yvette Carnell, like when Yvette and what's that other dude's name, Boyce Watkins? When they were working together, they both were keeping dossiers on each other. And then when they had beef, they started telling on each other. You know, it's and that's not for the interest of the people. So when you get some information about a prominent Black or a leading Black or a Black person that has a platform, you have to expose it. If you're holding back, compiling, or covering up, then you're just as guilty as that person. You expose that person. After that, you isolate them, meaning their access to our movements, our people, our community should be as limited as possible. And if it is in that time that they're isolated and their treachery is exposed, then you expel them. You expel them from the community, from the movement. Any titles, position, or honorariums that they heard, they have to be ousted. And this is to strengthen us as a collective, less so to punish the individual, but more so to strengthen our ability. We need protocols. There is no way for us to deal with treachery, generations of treachery, without coming up with solid protocols that can be tested and evaluated over time. This is not something that happens. You can't just say, I love my people, therefore, whatever I do as a byproduct works for my people. So we have to realize that our enemies and their servants within our community are evolving. And the greatest Afrocentric I ever met in my life was my grandma Bowie. Just to pivot, if you called her an African, she would be insulted, but she lived out the values. She didn't own one shred of kente cloth. She didn't celebrate Kwanzaa. She didn't have a bookshelf full of revolutionary African authors, but she used her time, talent, and resources to make a positive contribution to the just aspirations of African people. And it's from meeting the immediate material needs of her community to advocating for justice and the well-being of the collective, and identifying and taking a stance against injustices. And she didn't have the rhetoric, she didn't have the terminology, she didn't have the garb. She didn't even have the mindset of a militant. You would tell her, oh, Jesus said love everybody, and I love everybody, acting on what little bit had her, what sometimes called innate Africanity. So these Blacks, these visually African individuals, these people who are descendants of Frederick Douglass and these princes of Pan-Africanism, these people, bolsterous public figures, if they are not acting out, and it's so obvious, they snitch on themselves so readily, I don't even know how hard it is. I mean, I really just imagine if all the COINTELPRO agents had social media, and after they go set up the Panthers, or they go snitch on somebody in SNCC, and then they on Facebook with their money fans, falling out. I wish in this day and age, it's so obvious and so easy to identify the people who are faking the funk. But because of our critical thinking, because of menticide and our failures to uphold and to value intellectualism and critical thinking, we lose out. So we need to employ, if you don't like the new Negro self-exposure protocol, you give me another systematic way of identifying and limiting the harm of people who take a public position, but yet don't live up to their public position. Now, that's not for your uncle who show up to Thanksgiving to eat half the pork chops. Do they serve pork chops at Thanksgiving? Or eat half the turkey? And he say Black people they own worst enemy. You don't gotta put him on blast. But if it is a prominent Black person in a leadership position or seeking to be a voice or leader, then I think you should subject every person, including me, to the new Negro you can lead out, but the self-exposure protocol. And you expose yourself through your actions and words, and we critique you based on your actions and words, and how, whether or not they align, and whether or not they benefit us, or whether or not they contradict. Because there are some people, rare, that will say a lot of nonsense, but when you look at their actions, they take appropriate action. There used to be this brother, and when I was in the National Black United Front in Kansas City, and he would go around saying, Africa's the greatest country in the world, and we were all from kings and queens. He didn't really have an academic understanding, but the work he did in the community was always beneficial. He was the first one to show up and the last one to leave whenever there was any type of work to be done. Now, you work to educate a person like that, but you also make sure they get the adequate amount of recognition and praise for what they do right. So that's also part of the self-exposure protocol. Some people need material support. Some people need academic or intellectual support. Some people need to just be kicked to the curb as we move on and progress. But it has to be something that's laid out and articulated.
We covered a lot, so we would be remiss to have a discussion about demagogues in the African-centered community. And for me, at least one of us not to say the following. So I'll go ahead and say it. I'll go on the record and say, fuck Tariq Nasheed, fuck Umar Johnson, and fuck Boyce Watkins.
Okay.
I second all that.
I could add some names to that list.
What you say, Lena? What you say, Lena?
No, I said I really agree with all of those. Very good suggestions.
Yeah, I got a video of Boyce telling on himself, contradicting himself, all in the span of 15 minutes. So.
Right.
Yeah. So we covered a lot tonight, y'all, and so are there Geechee, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, that's it. I actually, yeah, let's end on this. So because we talked about it at the top, and then we should circle back right quick. So one of the critiques that we gave some of these people who feel like they need to punch down, one of the elders, supposedly elders, told me that, oh, they're changing laws in the schools and they're doing this, and I was like, can you think of all of the shit they was doing to black people and black kids, and this is the one that you're gonna organize and go, tear down the building for? So I want to kind of show you the link, if I could share my screen, and then I want y'all to respond again. Just, I guess, closing in. Why do you feel like these people are now excited about trying to organize and get shit done? And could you use that energy at all? Like, okay, now they're at the table. Like, for instance, this was something that the person was talking about. Oh, they passed this in South Carolina. And again, now people in this community are normally, who have power and wealth is white people. So you can't say that black LGBTQ people are having this political power and so forth. But again, why do you feel like, out of all the shit that was happening to kids and black people for all this time, this is the one issue that now you need to go fight and organize, because your kids wasn't attacked at any time soon, but now they're being attacked. Respond to that, please.
So this is about LGBTQT, I guess, being taught in schools.
So one of the things that I don't even know if the people know, like, because I remember we had two people that identify on a show, and they explained that most of these things are not teaching people a lifestyle, but more so not excluding those people from history. So most of the times the argument is not even founded on things that they have. So this person in particular said, oh, like, they have policies. So I went and go pull up some policy information. And I wanted to see what they was talking about. But again, they're arguing that this is something that we need to get involved with, or we need to stop or change. And my question is always like, okay, all the other things that are actual real things that we need to change that was affecting our children's education, like, now is the time for you to, be political.
Right. Right. I actually had a friend come to me about something similar to this. They called me in like a panic, and they were like, oh my God, Lena, can you believe they're talking about introducing like LGBTQT education into the schools? And I was like, I think that was a great idea. And I don't think that they were too happy with that response. Like you said earlier, it's essentially introducing people who are already historical figures, who had existing historical movements that gave benefits and rights to the people today who are benefiting from them. It's really just including them in history, and what their contribution to that was. I mean, I don't know, American history is convoluted, and that's a longer discussion. But in the overall things, I don't know why you wouldn't want them included. It's my daughter also had a field trip a few weeks ago, And, you know, in Texas, they really push Texas history a lot out here, like even more so than American history. And they went to what I thought was supposed to be like a regular park, and they ended up instead going to some reenactment of like how white people were living in the 1800s. And the crazy part of that was, in this like reenactment, they had rebuilt these settlements and did all these different things, but they literally eradicated Black people. Like, we didn't even exist. Like, there was no mention whatsoever of how a Black person in Texas would have been living in the 1800s, which is crazy considering that Texas was a huge port for the Pan-African slave trade, you know what I mean? And there would have been a substantial amount of Africans here during that period. And the way that they just eradicated them as if they didn't exist was really disgusting. And it sounds to me like this is the same thing against LGBTQ people. Like, they just want to remove them and erase them from history, and everybody is up in arms. I mean, gay people, LGBTQ people have always existed. They're always going to exist. They've always had a place. You know, they've always, you know, had some sort of in this country. They've always had a human rights fight. You know what I mean? And a lot of the LGBTQ movements were started by actual Black people, that you could say even the movement itself, maybe it wasn't called that, but the leaders of, you know, equality movements for gay people, for trans men or women, all those things, they were started by Black people. So really a lot of LGBTQ history is Black history. And you can't have American history without Black people and without LGBTQ people. So I mean, that's just people wanting to rewrite history and have some Puritan religious ideological view of events, and it's ridiculous and it's illogical.
If I could just, before Diallo opines, I just wanted to insert something real quick. You know, because this is actually my first time seeing this as well, so I just want to offer a quick comment. Now, you know, as one of the things that we didn't get to cover tonight was the fact that the evictions moratorium has expired earlier this year, and with the moratorium expiring, evictions are going to explode, especially in the Black community. Okay, in 2019, there were 150,000 eviction filings in Baltimore, Maryland. In Baltimore, Black people are 3 times higher to be evicted from their homes than white people are. Okay. This comes from the eviction study from the University of Southern California, Berkeley. Now, you would think that the people would be more concerned about stuff like that than they would be about like who's gay and who isn't and what's, you know, all like that. But then you have to remember the people that are so concerned about who's gay and what consenting adults do in the privacy of their bedroom and who's wearing manties and who's wearing panties and all this other nonsense. The people who are worried about that don't have to worry about where their rent money's coming from. They don't have to be concerned about the doctor's bills and how their children are going to eat and keep a roof over their heads. They don't have to worry about that because they sell books to folks about this bullshit and make money off of that. But the rest of us have to worry about that stuff. The rest of us have to worry about evictions. The rest of us have to, you know, so, you know, we need the people who are trying to drive us in these other directions about nonsense and get us, you know, take us off focus when it comes to the real problems that we're experiencing in this country. We need to just ignore them. Grifters are always going to grift. Okay. Con artists are always going to con, and demagogues are always going to, you know, demagogue. You know, we just need to be a critically thinking group of people who's going to be able to say, you know what, they're just grifters. They're just trying to distract us. We need to ignore them. I got to worry about my damn rent, man. Okay. To hell with the homosexual and all this other stuff. You know, I ain't got time to worry about that.
Well, my position is this. If you want to go in on the gay rights movement, the LGBTQAI plus community, I have one rule. If you want to critique anything, you have to critique it from the left. You have to critique from the left. The problem is you have a lot of black people that have legitimate gripes. You got black people who have legitimate gripes against the Democratic Party, but they critique it by leaning towards the Republican Party. You have a lot of black people that got legitimate gripes against the gangs and criminal predatory elements in our community, but they critique it from the side of the police. You got people who have legitimate gripes against the gay rights movement and its prominence over, or the way it's starting to overcloud other movements, the black rights, the women's rights, and things of that nature, but they do it from the right-wing evangelical. If you have a leftist critique of something, it can be heard. If you are trying to counter something that you have an issue with or you're against from the right wing, you are creating more oppression, more exploitation. You are feeding into the abuse. You become a bigger problem than the thing you claim is the problem. If you're anti-Democrat, if you got issues with the gay rights movement, if you got issues with these street thugs, these kids who won't pull their pants up, and you are coming from a right-wing perspective, you become a bigger problem and a bigger threat than the thing you are defining. There are legitimate criticisms of the gay rights movement. The gay rights movement is open to those critiques. Several of the pride marches for just this in the 2021 and 2020 and 2019, just in the last 3 years, and over almost half a century of gay rights struggle, are excluding the police from the pride parade. In New York City, you've had New York City cars painted in rainbow flag. For Pride Month of 2020, they showed the first all LGBTQ attack helicopter crew, from the pilot, the gunner, and everybody, and they were like, this is part of Pride. You have people in the LGBT movement that are now calling out Pride Day and Disney and all the multinational corporations that are exploiting third world resources and employing everything from slave labor and engaged in environmental destruction. But then they get to create the Apple logo is rainbow colored in June during Pride Month, and people give them a pass. So if you're coming and saying, listen, the gay rights movement is not radical enough, it's not leftist enough, it's not where's the racism in the gay movement? Where is the subversion of the systems and institutions of oppression? Where is the critique of gay capitalists, log cabin Republicans? Where is calling out J. Edgar Hoover? Where is the erasure of gay black people and LGBTQ black people within the movement? With the whitewashing of the Stonewall movie. So there's a lot of critiques. Anything, you can critique anything. I've been a vegan for almost 30 years. And but I got so much dirt on veganism, the vegan community, the vegan movement, the concept and approach to veganism all day. But all I'm saying is, if you're a person who has issues with the gay rights movement, first you examine yourself. What's up with me? And if you conclude that you are a person who is interested in the safety and security of black youth, correct education, and young people getting an appropriate education to prepare them to be full and fully cultivated adults, functional, fully cultivated adults. If you really sit down and say, what are my objectives? What do I really want? Why the hell am I doing this shit? And then you want to say, well, what role does the gay rights movement play in that? What role does including gay people or the gay rights movement in the curriculum? A lot of times the conclusions that you reach, if you come from it from a truly analytical point of view, you'll realize, damn, I'm mad at the wrong shit. I'm targeting the wrong enemy. So all I would say is, more likely than not, if you want to sincerely have the purest interest, what about the children? People, what about the babies? What are they teaching our babies? You'll find that you got more allies in the gay community in terms of education and what's best for the youth than enemies. But I don't think that the gays are above critique. I think that, and I'm just saying the gays because, the LGBTQ plus, but I think you have to come from a leftist point of view. And believe you me, you'll find a lot to critique a lot to dissect, a lot to criticize from the left, but you have to be leftist. You have to be anti-status quo. You have to be anti-capitalist. And if you're coming from a left point of view, then I'm willing to hear your critique. If you're just regurgitating right-wing hysterics and homophobia, you're a bigger problem than what you claim is the problem, is what I generally thought. And the question is always to anything, what threat does this pose to the status quo, and how does this support the status quo? The status quo is what's unjust. That's why we're revolutionary. That's why we're not reformist. That's not why the reason we can't reform. That's why we're not just activists. We become revolutionary because we know the fundamental core of this system is wrong. And no matter how much you fix stuff, how many women CEOs or gay military or allowing transgender people into the military to serve openly and all that, we know we are revolutionary because we know the core of this shit is corrupt and has to be dismantled. And if you're a revolutionary, then the first thing you ask about any of this, the reforms, LGBTQ reforms, or any other reforms, is how does this subvert the status quo, or how does this support the status quo? And you'll find many of the LGBTQ policies feed into and support the status quo. And what you should do is engage with that community to say, listen, y'all just feeding into capitalism and global white domination and white pathology. And you could say, hey, this is what you and your community or what we can do together to subvert that or to further radicalize and turn this from an integrationist movement and an attempt to get LGBTQ people status within the system versus helping to bring the time resources from that community, subverting and attacking the community. That's our goal.
So that's actually how we got pulled into it last time, because the question I asked was pretty much, if you of the community and you're a political enemy, do they get the heat as well? And when you answer that, that's when the brother kind of got in his pants. But any final words before we sign off? Asafo or anybody else? Lena?
Yeah, we were supposed to wrap up maybe a little bit over an hour, and it's almost 2 hours now. So this was just a great conversation. I appreciate y'all sticking with us. So
especially the people in the comments section. I saw some comments in there that was Lena had a few people debating over the could we settle or create anything in America, and I think they all end up agreeing with Lena. So appreciate y'all being in the comment section. Real quick, next week, I don't know if it's next week, I know next month, we have a lot of people in our community who play like they're economists. So we gonna have a real economist on here next month to kind of dig into some things to get some of that anti-blackness off of y'all. Derek Hamilton will be with us next month. Anything else that you want to share, something? Or Lena first?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to give y'all the time. Just go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say just thanks for having me on the show, and that was some great questions. And I agree with a lot of what you were saying earlier in terms of like a lot of these petty arguments and discussions that are not benefiting our community are distractions. You know what I mean? And they're stopping us from talking about more important issues and coming up with more solutions and figuring out better ways to organize. So I think, concentrating on that, and also, pushing more of a class analysis that we really need to start. We don't hear enough. There aren't enough discussions in our community about class analysis. And I think if we had more discussions about class analysis within our communities and how they affect us and how, they inhibit our ability to form solid, ideologies and platforms, I think we could move beyond a lot of these minor discussions that we're having here. So that would be cool to see, a discussion on that in the future. But other than that, I think that this was great, and you guys added a lot to the conversation. And I like the way Diallo inserted a lot of historical analysis and everything, which that's always very helpful.
But before we go to Diallo, tell us. So join the pack. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I created that probably about a year ago. And that was literally just to find more Pan-African people in we say Houston, but really like Harris County or anything, or even people outside of the area too that we can build with. So I was working with a group of people a few months ago, and we created a socialist constitution, and we were kind of contract that businesses could utilize to build socialist organizations rather than trying to build them on their own. And that's one of the platforms that I want to get off the ground with jointhepact.org. But there's a lot of other things we're working on. So I mean, anybody from anywhere that's looking to build in the Pan-African movement can definitely get in contact with me, or look me up on Lena Tee on Facebook as well.
All right, Bro Diallo, tell us your final thoughts and tell us a little bit about what you got going on, bro.
First of all, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on Barter and Build. I think it's one of the better platforms and forums to have. I think it's an honor that you guys deem me worthy of coming on, because I'm aware of the work and how serious you take your efforts and who you platform before the people. So thank you for that. You can reach me at Diallo Kenyatta across all platforms. Going into the new year, we have been working here in Chicago, basically developing. We have been working here in Chicago on working with, progressive politicians and advancing a progressive platform within the local political structure. It's not going very well because of all the hiccups. So we are also have a lot of grassroots efforts that we're working towards. For years, everybody mostly knows me, which is ironic because I never saw myself doing that, as like doing urban agriculture, cultivating vegan food and organic food. But we're definitely are moving towards cooperative economics and more grassroots efforts for empowerment, liberation, and promote radical Pan-Africanism on the south side of Chicago. So you can find me or communicate with me at Diallo Kenyatta across most social media platforms, and Diallo Kenyatta for archives, writings, blog posts, and all of that. So.
All right, so we want to thank both of you again for coming on, and we want to thank our viewers and those who supported this platform. Everyone who made a comment, we want to thank everyone, and we appreciate that. And we appreciate all of you, and we'll see you next time. Peace, everyone. You have a good night.
Some foolish people out here who look at their personal relations with white folk, and they have good white friends. And I'm not doubting the sincerity of the friendship. Not at all. Not at all. I do not doubt that blacks and whites can be truly friendly, and we should be friendly as people. And I don't see any problem with having those friends, But do not confuse your personal relations with the relations between groups.